It's not bound by any barriers. It will take ideas from all sorts of places. And it's also music that I think is for the head. When I sit down and listen to music, I want to listen to something that's a bit challenging and makes me think. And progressive rock does that.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode, along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. Kevan Furbank is this episode's guest. He's here to talk about his book, 1972, When Progressive Rock Ruled the World. The year 1972 was when progressive rock came of age, when bands and artists still revered today produced some of their most groundbreaking, inventive, and enduring musical creations. Kevan Furbank looks at some of the artists and albums that made 1972 such a watershed in musical achievement. He follows their development from the first tentative notes and chords to the full-blown recordings that, more than 50 years later, are still seen as the masterpieces of the genre and the gold standard by which all progressive rock is judged. In this episode, he talks about the book and the legendary bands covered inside, including, yes, Genesis, Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Uriah Heep, Pink Floyd, and more. A playlist of the songs from the albums discussed in this episode on the show notes page. Hi, Kevan. Welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast. Nice to meet you.
And nice to meet you. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
So you choose 22 progressive rock albums to spotlight in this book, and I'm curious as to how you come up with that specific number and what went into deciding which albums to include.
Well, generally when the company does these books, they like you to choose 20. But I just couldn't decide. I couldn't whittle it down to 20, so it ended up with 22. And of course, with some of the bands featured in the book, they may have done 2 albums in a year, you see. Because, back in the day, a lot of bands would do that. Certainly back in the 60s, 2 albums a year would be standard for any band. I mean, these days, it's like an album every 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so back in 72, there were a few bands that did 2 albums in a year. And I thought, I can't really do one without mentioning the other. So that's why we've ended up with 22.
Gotcha. So then what went into deciding what was going to make that list of 22?
Well, for a start, I love progressive rock. And now I was a little too young to fall in love with it in 72. I would have been about 11. So my experience of progressive rock probably started around about 1977, 1978. But then I went backwards and I discovered that 72 has just got some of the most iconic albums of the genre. I mean, albums that are still relevant and listened to today and still people talk about today. And in fact, modern progressive rock is judged against some of these albums that came out in 72. So I have to say, a lot of these were no-brainers. I mean, Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick. How can you not include that? Yes, Close to the Edge is an obvious one. The Genesis Foxtrot, which has that wonderful sidelong track in Supper's Ready. I mean, these are albums that people are still talking about and playing today. I did throw in a few slightly off-the-wall ones, like the Santana. Is Santana prog? I thought there was enough in their album of that year to justify that. Uriah Heep, some people saying, was Uriah Heep prog? And I would argue that was their most prog album, Demons and Wizards for 1972. The only time perhaps they really were a prog. So yeah, most of the time it sort of fell into place. It was obvious what albums to choose. And also I wanted to choose albums I could write about as well. I didn't want this just to be a collection of facts and figures. I wanted it to be a good read as well. And I wanted to be able to tell the reader little things they may not have known about the albums, about the way they were made and that sort of thing. So that's why I've ended up with the collection I've got. And now in the back of the book, I do a list of other albums that were around that year. And, perhaps we could have a very long argument on your podcast about odd albums that perhaps should have been in and didn't and what have you. But there we are. That's all part of the fun. It's all subjective, isn't it? And we all have our loves and our hates and what have you. And this is my collection of 22 loves. And I hope for most people, they would agree with most of those selections.
Yeah, and somebody recently was asking me, how do you define progressive rock? And I said, well, it's just longer songs, more experimentation. There's the use of different instruments. How would you define progressive rock?
I've also written a book about 1967, and that's interesting because that's the growth of psychedelic rock. And progressive rock really grew out of that. It was a time when bands were being allowed to really spread themselves in the studio and do all sorts of things. And for that, I credit the Beatles. In fact, I do quote in this book Bill Bruford, who you may recall was the drummer for both Yes and King Crimson.
Absolutely.
And he said, without the Beatles or someone else who had done what the Beatles did, it's fair to assume there would have been no progressive rock. They broke down every barrier that ever existed. And that's basically, for me, how it starts. The Beatles broke down the barriers. They allowed artists to have complete control over what they produced, which meant that the artists were pulling in influences from all over the place. It wasn't just rock and pop. It was classical music. It was jazz. It was folk. It was music from other cultures, like the Indian music and that sort of thing. And I think that, for me, is what's special about progressive rock music, that it's not bound by any barriers. It will take ideas from all sorts of places. And it's also music that I think is for the head rather than, I mean, I like a good bop. I like a good dance, and that's great. But when I sit down and listen to music, I want to listen to something that's a bit challenging and makes me think, and progressive rock does that.
It's amazing that Beatles, actually, I had that quote pulled up here in front of me too, that Bill Bruford said. And it's amazing because it takes an influential band to break a barrier down, because otherwise you think, how are these record labels, how are you going to convince them to make this type of music? Because they had this mindset of 3-minute songs, got to get it on AM radio. To be able to do that, you had to have somebody like the Beatles push it forward or open the door.
You had to. And if it hadn't been the Beatles, would it have been someone else? Who knows? Maybe the Who could have done it. The trouble is, see, so much of the music of the 60s comes from the Beatles. And so if the Beatles hadn't existed, like that film, I don't know if you ever saw it in an American film called Yesterday, a chap wakes up to discover that the Beatles don't exist and never existed.
Oh, I did see that.
He's the only one who knows
Yes.
their songs. And so, you know, lots of other things that don't exist, like Oasis and various other bands. But anyway, I digress. The Beatles are the catalyst. A lot of the record companies at the time, back in the 60s and in 1972, they didn't know what on earth their artists were doing. They just had to trust that their artists would produce music that would sell. And undoubtedly, there was a lot produced during the time that didn't sell. But they were lucky that most record labels had on their roster bands like Jethro Tull and Gentle Giant and Genesis and Yes, who were making music that really connected with people back in 72.
Should also credit FM freeform radio too. That was a huge thing.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And again, back in my 1967 book, I do point that out, that FM stations were playing sidelong pieces of music. They were happily playing the whole lot on an LP. And so that encouraged people to make music that stretched away from the 3.5 minute boundary, that went 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the entire side of an album, or even in the case of Jethro Tull, one piece of music stretched across 2 sides of an album. Obviously, you had to turn it over, but if you listen to the CD version, there's no break between it all. There's a sort of nice windy effects in the middle that join everything together. So it's one long, continuous piece of music. And as you say, you know, if FM stations were brave enough to sort of play that sort of thing. I mean, I guess also it was a fairly cheap way of filling airtime at the time as well. But
at the time.
But yeah, and so that really helped those early bands get their music out there amongst the audience and encourage them to do interesting things.
Can you talk about how things like technology, the addition of instruments like the mellotron and synthesizers, changes in society as well, all play a role in what progressive rock would become?
Absolutely. If you go back to the 1950s and you've got simple sort of 3-chord rock and roll and things like that, and performed by people who weren't very well educated, and you know, probably some of them could barely write their own names. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, you get a lot more sort of education, people going to art school and coming out of that and reading lots of books and getting immersed in lots of philosophy and different religious beliefs and that sort of thing. And so they're key to sort of put everything they've learned, all their knowledge, into their music. And so far as technology is concerned, you forget that the Beatles, when they made Sgt. Pepper, they had 4-track recording to play with, which meant you had to record, say, drums and bass on one track, and then something else on another track, and then bounce those down onto one track to get the orchestra. I mean, they worked wonders, but they just had 4 tracks of tape to work with. And of course, you come to 72 and you're talking about 24-track recording and that sort of thing. And so people could endlessly tinker and put different bits on different tracks and then sit there and mix each individual track together. So yeah, the technology is amazing. The use of the mellotron. I mean, again, the mellotron was around in the 60s, but it was huge. It was the size of a wardrobe. And if you accidentally nudged it, it went out of tune and the tapes got mangled and all this sort of thing. But of course, by 72, you've got a smaller mellotron. You've got other synthesized instruments coming along that are portable and can be used on stage. So you've got the technology there really making a lot of this stuff possible. But don't forget, though, I mean, these days, you can do everything digitally, can't you? You can sort of hit a key and you've cut something and you splice something. Back in 72, when they were making Close to the Edge, which is a sidelong piece of music, they were still using a razor blade and a bit of Chinograph pencil to sort of cut bits of tape. There's one episode there where they're looking for a particular piece of music they loved. They couldn't find it anywhere. Where is it? Where in the studio did we put it? And they thought, well, maybe the cleaner threw it out. And so they go outside and they search through the bins and they eventually find this important piece of tape that had been chucked in the bin. So, it was still very hand to mouth,
Right.
the way of working back then, and it's amazing that they produced what they did, given that some of the technology was still quite basic.
There were happy accidents too. A lot of those accidents would happen and say, hey, that sounds cool. Let's go with that.
Absolutely. And if you imagine if the record company had been in charge of the studio, or the manager had been in charge, or heaven help us, the accountants were in charge, well, then that wouldn't have ever seen the light of day. They would have said, no, that's rubbish, cut it out, redo it, do it properly. But the happy accidents are sometimes what make the music so special. I mean, I go back to the Beatles again, the beginning of I Feel Fine, where George Harrison hits a note and it vibrates a bottle that's sitting on top of a musical instrument. And they think, wow, that sounds great. And they keep that in as the intro. So yeah, happy accidents are what make the music just that little bit sort of extra special.
So I want to pick out some of the albums from the list of 22 that were released in the year 1972 that are highlighted in the book. And the first is one of my favorites, Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick.
Yeah.
Talk about how the previous album, 1971's Aqualung, would lead frontman Ian Anderson to come up with Thick as a Brick.
Aqualung had a number of sort of themed songs on it. Ian Anderson, very intelligent guy. I mean, I've spoken to him on a couple of occasions. I mean, brains to spare, and he does get quite heavily into the ideas of religion. I don't think he's particularly religious himself, but he would talk a bit about sort of religion and churches and things. And Aqualung had a number of tracks that had that common theme. It wasn't a concept album, but it had, for example, one track that referenced another track and that sort of thing. And so people thought it was a concept album. And because of that, Ian Anderson sort of said to himself, right, I'm going to give you the mother of all concept albums. I'm going to deliberately create something that is a concept album, and you can have endless fun poring over it and discussing it and thinking about it. And so that's how he came up with Thick as a Brick. Now, as I say in the book, it's interesting that he's doing it bit by bit and they're rehearsing it and they're adding bits on, and they discover as they go along, yes, this is working as one whole piece of music. And they put it all together. And then they spend more time actually working on the cover than they do on the music, because the cover is full of strange things that you can pore over. It's done in the style of a newspaper. It's got all the lyrics on there, but Ian Anderson pretends they've been written by a young boy rather than an old fellow with a flute.
Gerald Bostock.
Yeah, Gerald Bostock, yeah. And it's full of really weird stories and all done in the style of a very local parochial newspaper. So that was a deliberate thing where Anderson said, right, I'm going to bamboozle everybody with a concept album. And he did it again in 1973 with the follow-up, A Passion Play. Not as instantly accessible as Thick as a Brick turned out to be. I actually love it, but I can see why an awful lot of people would be turned off it. And he really sort of abandoned that and went back to doing song-based albums. But yeah, Thick as a Brick is, for me, possibly the ultimate concept album, not just in the music, but in the packaging and the entire immense amount of thought and fun that went into it. I mean, it is an absolutely amazing work of art.
And Gerald Bostock, that character relates to Ian somehow?
It only relates to him in that Ian Anderson had lots of thoughts about his parents, his father particularly. I mean, I think he's sung at times about his relationship with his father and that sort of thing. And I think he just, rather than make it Ian Anderson's thoughts about himself, he tends to write from the third person. He's very similar to Roy Harper in a way. They both inspired each other, but Roy Harper was the sort of songwriter who would write about his feelings and what he thought. Ian Anderson wouldn't. Ian Anderson would tend to write from more of a third person. And I think that's why he did this. He didn't want this to be Ian Anderson's thoughts on parenthood and the world and everything. So that's why he created this character. And that's all it is. I mean, has just come out of Ian Anderson's imagination.
As you were writing your chapter on the Genesis album, Foxtrot, Genesis were playing the final dates at the O2 Arena in London. Back in 1972, Genesis, not the commercial juggernaut that they would become. Watcher of the Skies leads off the album. It's released as a single. This took shape while the band was on tour and performed long before the album was recorded. Can you talk about the lyrics, who wrote them, when they were written, and what are they about?
Yeah, you're right when you say that Genesis back in 72, probably if this Foxtrot hadn't been a well-received album and a popular album, there's a possibility we wouldn't be talking about them very much. There'd be a footnote in progressive rock history. But thankfully, they're not, and they went on to become a really big pop band. But so far as Watcher of the Skies was concerned, I mean, I spoke to Steve Hackett about this, and he was constantly on at the band to get a Mellotron. He'd seen King Crimson perform and saw what an amazing sound King Crimson were making with a Mellotron. And then he saw an ad in the paper that suggested that Robert Fripp of King Crimson had the very Mellotron used on their debut album for sale. Turned out Fripp actually had probably half a dozen different Mellotrons and was saying exactly the same thing about each one. But nevertheless, he persuaded them to buy it. Tony Banks was just practicing it during a lull, during a stage show, and just trying to find chords that really worked with it. Because if you didn't play the right chords with the Mellotron, it could sound awful. So he was looking at these sort of chords and things, and came up with the beautiful chord sequence that you hear on the track. And then you've got Phil Collins, who supplies that very strange beat in The Watcher of the Skies, very difficult to play along with, very staccato sort of beat. And there are some people, some bass players like John Wetton, who have tried to play along with it and sing at the same time and have found that they just can't do it. So far as the lyrics are concerned, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford wrote these while on a roof of a building during a sound check for a show in Naples.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it is. And it's typical sort of public school sort of education stuff. It's an 1817 poem by John Keats, which they sort of mixed up with a bit of Homer and all sorts of things to create these lyrics. What do they actually mean? I'm not too sure whether they mean a huge amount. And this is the thing with progressive rock lyrics. They can sound very deep, but sometimes then you look at them and they're not as deep as you think they are. I mean, yes, obvious example of this, where John Anderson would write lyrics that really just sounded good and fitted the music, and even he wasn't too sure what on earth he was singing about. So I wouldn't sort of read too much into it, but it's certainly lyrics that seem to go with that dramatic feel of the music, seem to work so well with it.
Yeah, and I believe the poem is titled On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. I think that's the one. So people can read the poem and listen to the song, and maybe you can figure out what they're saying. What are they talking about?
All about.
Yeah. Yes released Close to the Edge in 1972, and you note that the band was literally close to the edge when they made this album. What was going on with the band at the time and the difficulties that they had making the album?
The difficulties they had, well, you see, they'd made Fragile in 1971. And there's a long track on that sort of Heart of the Sunrise, which really went down well with audiences. And so they sort of said to themselves, well, look, let's try and write more long tracks. In fact, let's try and write something that's as long as the side of the album. But of course, the main songwriters were really John Anderson and Steve Howe. And they would sort of be sitting there, sort of bouncing ideas and thinking this and thinking that and what have you. And some of the other members will be getting just a little bit bored. You know, I mean, Bill Bruford, the drummer, I mean, he sort of says that really he was going out of his mind with boredom, sort of sitting there waiting for decisions to be made. And they weren't very good at making decisions. They'd sort of, what do you think? What do you think? I don't know. They got so bad at making decisions that they were even asking the cleaner what they thought. And so, you know, it could well be that the album is what it is thanks to the input of the cleaners. Who knows? But I think the actual sort of composing process was so long and so difficult that it certainly drove Bill Bruford out of the band. He just sort of said, I can't go through that experience anymore of not knowing what's going on, no one making a decision, not being as involved in the composing as I'd like to be, and all this. So he went, and then Rick Wakeman followed him pretty much after Tales from Topographic Oceans the year after. So it was really that sort of compositional process. If you weren't writing the songs, then it was very difficult to sit there and listen to it all and put up with it all. So that's what happened, unfortunately, with that. But, you know, at the end of the day, great album comes out of it still, and one that they were all rightly proud of.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Author Kevan Furbank is with us. The book is 1972, When Progressive Rock Ruled the World. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they're interesting in that they're one of the few progressive rock bands on this list to have a crossover hit single, like a big hit single. From the Beginning was top 40 in the U.S., and that's from 1972's Trilogy album. But ELP was often criticized even by those who championed early prog bands like DJ John Peel. Why was that? And what is your response to those critics?
One of the big accusations always leveled at progressive rock music, especially by those who like to take the gentle Mickey out of it, is that it's so self-indulgent. I mean, and I know it's a bit pretentious, isn't it? It's above itself. It has these highfalutin sort of ideas, and probably if you were looking at a band that had pretensions of being almost like a classical orchestra, then Emerson, Lake and Palmer probably were that band. Partly because they did play an awful lot of music that was inspired by the classics. So in particular by Aaron Copland, a great American classical composer, of course, who did Fanfare for the Common Man, which Emerson, Lake and Palmer had a massive hit with in 1977. And so their music would be very much classical inspired. I think for some people, like John Peel, and bear in mind, John, I don't know how much your listeners know about John Peel. I mean, he was a very influential broadcaster in the UK, and he did back a lot of progressive rock. He was very into it in the beginning. But as soon as punk came along in about 76, 77, he pretty much dispensed with progressive rock whatsoever, completely, and he concentrated on supporting punk bands. And I suppose this might have been a very early example of him saying, wait a minute, this is all getting a bit much. This is all getting just a bit pompous and pretentious. And Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as I say, were probably a prime example of a band that could go heavily over the top when they wanted to. I mean, they did go on the road with an orchestra, and Keith Emerson would put knives into his keyboards, and sometimes his keyboard and he would rise into the air, and they would play in midair and all this. So you can understand why some people looked at ELP and saw them as the almost unacceptable face of progressive rock. My view, well, I love them. I think they produce great music. I never got to see them live because I was too young. They did do a few albums at the end of their time, so at the end of the 70s, that were a bit ropey. But Trilogy is an absolutely brilliant album. I mean, it's got such great music on it. Self-penned music and adaptations. It's got Hoedown on it, which is a Copland piece of music.
That's almost, there's a sense of humor in that track too. It's
a sense of humor. Well, they did make a point of trying to put a funny track on each album.
Right.
And they're the worst tracks on the album. So in the case of Trilogy, it's The Sheriff is probably the worst track on the album because they are deliberately trying to be funny and trying to combat that image of them as being sort of po-faced and self-important. But Hoedown just thunders along at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It's an absolute blast. It's a fantastic piece of music. Well done, Aaron Copland, but well done, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, for taking it and speeding it up by 150 miles an hour and making something extra special out of it.
I agree with you. Maybe also because I listened to these songs many years after they were initially released. So when you're listening to this music and you're not putting it into context, what is out at that time, and you're not inundated by the interviews that you read in magazines and so forth, you can just listen to it as is, as a separate piece of work. And you're not considering the fact that there's all these other bands that sound just like this band. I mean, that happened a lot with the 80s bands too, the hair metal bands. They fell into that same category where everybody's rolling their eyes. And but there are some very talented musicians that...
There are some. I mean, if you look at the progressive rock of 72, they're very talented musicians. An awful lot of them have gone to music school and really learned how to play their instruments properly. I mean, the members of Gentle Giant, I think they played something like 24 instruments between them or something like that.
Wow.
A lot of them instruments you never heard of before. And so they were very good at what they could do. The other thing is that they all came with different influences. They didn't come with progressive rock influences. Steve Howe was a lover of Chet Atkins. And others had sort of different musical influences they all brought together. The difference with the 1980s sort of prog bands that popped up is that they were inspired by the 1970s progressive rock. And so inevitably they were going to sound like the 70s bands. But the 70s bands sounded like nothing else before them. And that's what, to me, just makes that era so special.
In 1972 was also the year Pink Floyd released Obscured by Clouds. Your decision to include it on your list of 22 albums is interesting. Talk about why this album is so important.
I've been a bit cheeky with this one, really, because I guess if you were really going to say, is it one of the best progressive rock albums of 1972, then I think you'd be hard-pressed to support that. But then again, it's Pink Floyd, and nowadays, Pink Floyd, are one of the cornerstones of progressive rock. I mean, how can you not include them? But of course, back then, 72, that was before Dark Side of the Moon, before the album that really made their name. And for a long time, from their debut in 67 to Dark Side of the Moon, they were flailing about all over the place, producing all sorts of strange music that just really wasn't doing terrifically well. I included Obscured by Clouds because I thought it contained a lot of elements, a lot of the sound that was to coalesce into Dark Side of the Moon. Certainly on tracks like Childhood End and things like that, you can hear Time and Breathe, two of the tracks from Dark Side, in that. So that's why I included that. I felt it was an important stepping stone to 1973's massive album. And I thought, I can't ignore the Floyd. I'm sorry, I can't relegate.
You got to find a way to get them in there.
Got to get them in there. So I can't relegate them to a footnote.
Yeah. Well, they talk about Metal too. Metal from the year before, 71. It's another one where, like, one of these days you hear what's to come.
Yes, absolutely, and Echoes as well in the full length Echoes.
Right. Echoes,
you hear also from that what is to come as well. So yeah, maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on them. I mean, they did do things like Amagama and more, and they did an awful lot of soundtracks, which is interesting because I think they're sort of the music they came up with, which was frequently long, slow, spacey, atmospheric. It lended itself well to some of the films that were popping up in the late 60s, early 70s. So, that's worth pointing out as well. But as you say, you can listen to a few albums. Obscured by Clouds is one of them. Meadow is another one. Perhaps Atom Heart Mother as well, traces of that. And you can hear it all coming together as Dark Side of the Moon. Now, I'm doing a book on 1977 at the moment while we speak. And of course, that year it's Animals.
Yes. I love Animals. Yeah,
I love Animals. And actually, it's probably my favorite. But a lot of those later albums are Pink Floyd trying to recreate Dark Side of the Moon, or trying to better it. And do they ever succeed? Don't know. That's one we can discuss. But anyway, so that'll be an interesting project as well. But you can't ignore the Floyd, I'm afraid. So that's why they got in.
Yeah, in my personal pick from Obscured by Clouds would be Free 4. It's a fun song. It's an unexpected type of Pink Floyd song, a folkish type of song.
Yet its lyrics are interesting because they're pretty much the first time that Roger Waters starts singing about his father. And so the lyrics are a bit down, but the songs are jaunty
Right.
sing along, you know. So you're absolutely right. It is an interesting juxtaposition.
I want to skip ahead on the list of Frank Zappa's album, The Grand Wazoo. Zappa was lucky to be alive to see this album be released. There's the story of what happened to him in concert in December of 71, which is interesting because it actually has a connection to the Turtles. Mark Volman and Howard Kalin were part of Zappa's band, but after what happens to Frank in December of 71, during their downtime, they end up moving on and forming their own duo. But talk about what happened in December of 71. This leads off the chapter on the album, The Grand Wazoo.
Go back just a little bit and just tell you why I included the Zappa album.
Yeah.
I mean, A, because there was a danger that the book would be a little bit too British, because progressive rock did tend to be more of a British preoccupation than, for example, an American one. But I think the big exception to that, and someone who I consider to be one of the greatest of American composers, is Frank Zappa. The Grand Wazoo is interesting because he nearly died just before that, as you said. He's at the Rainbow Theatre in London, and they're doing an encore of I Want to Hold Your Hand. And one of the fans decides to jump on stage and push Zappa into the orchestra pit. Why is this? Well, he claims Zappa was looking at his girlfriend in a funny way. Then he sort of also claimed Zappa wasn't giving value for money. Well, I'll tell you something. There's one thing Zappa always did. It was give value for money. He would play for hours and he would play non-stop. I mean, everything would be segued together and the music would go on and on. So that doesn't really stand up. As for looking at his girlfriend, well, come on. I mean, Zappa looked probably at everybody's girlfriend, not just. So he plummets into the orchestra pit. He's got a broken ankle, a broken rib. He's got a crushed larynx. He's got a paralyzed arm. Whether he would have survived, probably, but amazing that he takes a break from music, and because of this, everybody in the band pretty much disappears. I mean, Howard Kalin and Mark Volman, they go off and become, is it the Flo and Eddie?
Flo and Eddie, yeah.
Flo and Eddie, yeah, that's right. So they go back to doing their own thing, and a lot of the members of the band really just have to make their own way and sort of find other jobs and that sort of thing while Zappa is convalescing. But it doesn't stop him. He continues writing music. He continues conducting music. He conducts a big session from his wheelchair that leads to 2 albums. One is Waka Jawaka, and the other one is what I think is his best album of that year, which is The Grand Wazoo. And it's an amazing mixture of rock and jazz and sort of freeform jazz and a bit of freeform orchestral and all sorts of strange things, all mixed together. And the whole thing is done, it's a concept album that's loosely based on Christianity, but then I won't go into it because it's really convoluted and difficult to understand. But this is a man who you just can't kill him. You can't kill Zappa. He just comes flying back and produces great music no matter what happens to him. And thankfully, he went on, for another good, 14, 16 years as a touring artist. Died sadly in the 1990s, but still made some great albums after that. But he must have thought, well, that's my guitar playing days over. Paralyzed arm, fractured this, that, and the other, but thankfully recovered. And yeah,
I think you described him in the book too. He's like staring blankly, just like looking off and
looking off, and they probably thought he was dead. It was so scary.
Another interesting album was Santana's Caravanserai. All right, yeah. So you have a chapter on this one. This is really interesting. The head of Columbia and CBS, Clive Davis, told Carlos he was committing career suicide by releasing this album. 2 sides of almost continuous music weaving through jazz, rock, funk, and bossa nova. Nothing that could be released as singles, but opinions have changed over time. Why is it important for you to include this one in the book?
I love it for a start. I think it's an absolutely fascinating album. There are some people who don't think that's prog. In fact, there was a review of the book in a publication over here, and they said, he includes that Santana album. Is it prog, though? I think it is. I think because of the huge range of influences in it. I mean, Santana started off, a great band, but a great sort of Latin feel band. But on Caravanserai, he really stretches out. He embraces all sorts of strange jazz and ethnic influences, as well as, for me, prog influences as well. And the fact that it all links together into two sides of a suite, it's a fabulous album. And yes, at the time, he was accused of committing career suicide because there's a lot of instrumentals on it. There's a lot of tracks that don't appear to go anywhere. There's a lot of percussion in them, and some tracks that are a little more than just percussion. But later people, I think, later listeners have come back to it with fresh ears and realized just what interesting things he was doing. So yeah, for me, it's a great album. I love the follow-up Welcome as well, which is again a very jazz influenced album.
And for fans of Journey and Neil Schon, Neil's on this album. I think this might be the last one before he.
That's the last one, yeah. And off they went. And
Greg Rowley.
And there was a lot of dispute over the direction Santana should go. I mean, he was getting quite spiritual, reading spiritual things, wanting to put them into the music. Whereas the likes of Neil Schon was saying, no, don't rock the boat. Don't change the formula because it's working so well. Having said that, Neil Schon has a lot of writing credits on this, and so they're fully involved in making this album. It's not as if they just sat down and played what he wanted them to play. A lot of the time, they're taking the lead in some of this stuff. So all credit to them. They really enter into it. They help him produce a really interesting album, and then off they go and create Journey. Now, I wouldn't say Journey are one of my favorite bands, as it's a bit sort of AOR for me, but great album from Santana. And is it prog? I think it is. I think Welcome is prog. Amigos later, which is sort of his comeback album, it's not so much prog, perhaps. It's more sort of Latin music, although there's one great prog tune on it, which is Dance Sister Dance, which is fantastic. But yeah, I think it's fully justified to have Caravanserai in this book. And I think it's an interesting insight into the way the band worked and the pressures, because there was a time when Santana, the band, was touring without Santana because they'd sacked him. People were turning up and saying, hold on, where's the guy who's playing?
What time period was that? When did that?
That was around about that time,
Yeah.
It was, when they had their big falling out and they go on tour and they don't want him. But then they have to ring him up and say, look, there's too many complaints. People are saying this is crazy. You can't have Santana without Santana.
And he changed his name to David Dipp or David.
Well,
Dipp.
yes, he along with John McLaughlin, another great jazz guitarist of the time, both of them getting heavily into Eastern religion, and they're each given a name by their guru. Santana's is Devadip. I probably could look through and remind myself precisely what it means, but I can't remember for the moment. But,
that's homework for our listeners.
Yeah.
Uriah Heep. We have to talk about Uriah Heep, Demons and Wizards, 1972. This is the album that not only was a hit in Europe, but also broke them here in the U.S. Phenomenal album. The opening track, The Wizard. Let's talk about that one, the origins of the lyrics, and how a pot of tea ends up in the song.
Well, once again, this is another band that some people don't think are prog. And actually, when their first album was released, it really wasn't greeted very well. In fact, I opened the piece with a quote from the Rolling Stone critic Melissa Mills, who said about their debut album, if this group make it, I'll have to commit suicide, which is a little bit extreme.
Wow. I read that. Yeah. Whew.
Yeah. And really, if someone were to say that these days in a review, they'd be rightly sort of slagged off, because it's no laughing matter, that sort of thing. But I think what she was obviously trying to say is she hated it so much.
Yeah.
The idea of them being successful was anathema to her. But the Heap have been going on for donkey's years. I mean, again, we could look up on Wikipedia and find out how many albums they've made, because they released one not too long ago, I think.
Well, I just happen to have it in front of me here, Kevin. Let's see. Uriah Heep. Yeah, studio albums, 25 total. So by the time they had this, this has been 1, 2. This is album number 4, Demons and Wizards.
Yeah.
25 total, including one that just came out last year, Chaos in Color.
That's right.
Nick Box is still he's got the band continuing through. I think they're still going today.
Yeah. So no matter what some sniffy people may say about them, there's a huge fan base out there that have kept the Heap going all these years. And so you have to say, hats off to them. As to Demons and Wizards, I think it is their most progressive album. They were getting closer and closer to it with their previous albums. And the big song on it is The Wizard, which sort of opens the album. And it does start with acoustic guitar and then the sound of a whistling kettle. So they were brewing up a pot of tea in the studio. It's such an English thing to do, isn't it? And they discovered that the key of the kettle was in C, which was perfectly in tune with the song. So there we are. They happily incorporated the noise of the kettle into
There's our
song.
happy musical moment of the episode.
Happy musical moments, those that you were talking about earlier. The lyrics came from a dream that Hensley had, Ken Hensley. And he had a dream about meeting some wizard. And night after night, he was meeting this wizard in his dream. So eventually he wrote about this, and suddenly the wizard was gone. The dream never happened again. So maybe, it was telling him to write the song.
David Byron, he had quite a voice.
Quite a pair of lungs on him. Absolutely, quite a pair of lungs. And other people in it as well. Great guitarist Mick Box. Fantastic guitar sound from him. They were also pretty good at writing the odd really commercial hit single as well. So, they wrote Easy Living, which appears on the album, and, had hit single written all over it and became a hit. Now, a lot of bands at the time, especially progressive rock bands, they looked down on singles. They saw singles as a sort of a commercial sellout. And so you'd very rarely find prog bands releasing, certainly in the UK. It happened more in America because the record labels thought they wouldn't notice. And so a few Yes tracks end up as singles in America, like Roundabout was pretty popular in America, but very few of them do, apart from Uriah Heep, who had a totally commercial head on them and absolutely loved writing and having hit singles.
Yeah, Easy Living was top 40. That peaked at number 39 in the US. Yeah, that's written in just... I've got it right here. Written in just 15 minutes. And then you say in the book that the band's hectic touring schedule led to the song title.
Yeah, it was, what's the word I'm looking for? They were being cynical about it. They'd really worked hard. They were exhausted. And then one of them sort of said, this is easy living, isn't it? I think because they'd also read somewhere that, the idea of a rock band is that they've got it made, a successful rock band. They're having a great time. They're being ferried around in limousines. They have all the young lady admirers that they could ever wish for and all this sort of thing. And it's a great life. The reality is, of course, for a lot of bands, that it's an absolute hard slog. And you get up, you get in the van, you drive for 8 hours, you get out, you play the gig, you go to bed, you get up, and you're on a treadmill. And that really seemed to be the case with Uriah Heep at this time. And that's like one of them sort of said, this is easy living, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he was being sarcastic, and they then created the song out of that title.
Quite sarcastic, because I had Steve Pilkington, the author, your fellow Sonic Bond publishing author, who wrote a book on Uriah Heep, and he told the story. I can't remember which member of the band, but he broke his hand. You're just like, no time off. You got to get back out there on stage. He's and the guy's out there playing with a broken hand or whatever it was. It was just the way it was back then. Like you say, 2 albums per year, constantly touring, just the way it was.
Just the way it was. And it's no wonder the Beatles gave up in 66 and probably produced some of their best work after that. But yeah, it was a treadmill. And of course, you were being fleeced all the time by managers and record labels, this sort of thing. So, unless you were really at the top of your game and you really knew what you were doing, you probably didn't make a great deal of money. And I don't think the situation really has changed. These days, you either have people who are making more money than you can imagine, and then everybody else making less money than you think. And I've known of bands who have come back from touring America, come back to Northern Ireland, and all they can afford to eat for lunch is a bag of crisps.
Well, you're right. There are artists nowadays who have 3-4 bands going at the same time. It is, yes, they love doing it, but it's work. It's income.
Yeah.
They have to make the money.
Yes, and no one makes money out of CDs anymore, out of albums, because obviously they get ripped and stuck on the internet before you know it, or they're live streamed or streamed through Spotify or anything, and they don't get a lot of money out of those.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to know what the future holds for popular music, which is why I think it's so good to remember the ones in the past, in the days when they were able to make this sort of music.
It's story time. some of these artists and bands are still around and performing, yes, but now it's time. Let's hear the stories. So many great stories from
So many great stories.
collection.
And I think
over
perhaps
the years.
we could put out a plea here, Eric. Buy the albums, folks.
Yeah.
Don't rip them off. Buy the albums and buy a ticket and see your favorite band. I mean, yeah, ticket prices are extortionate these days as well. That's the other thing. 150 quid to see an artist or something like that. Sometimes you do think that's a bit much.
However, on the other side of it, though, some of these bands and artists you can see in a smaller venue for.
Yeah.
Like I went to see a show. There's a band around here called Big Head Todd and the Monsters. Great band. It was like $60.
Yeah.
And I was right there in front. So it depends. The Stones, you won't pay $60.
No, you won't pay $60 for Stones, and you wouldn't pay for Elton John or something like that.
No, I think they charge $60 to use the urinal at a Stones concert.
That's right. Yeah. That's for the program. That's just
exactly for the program. So you finished the book with some honorable mentions, and you mentioned earlier that it was hard coming up with a list of 20, so you're able to get it to 22. But even saying that, you got the Moody Blues' Seventh Sojourn, ELO's self-titled album, just to name a few. And then that's followed by your thoughts on where prog went next after 1972. So what became of the bands on the list? Also, you state that, quote, today we live in what is both the best and worst times for progressive rock. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, look, starting about where they went next, the great era of early progressive rock was probably 69 to about 77. In 77, punk rock did come along, but it's a little bit of a myth that it sort of destroyed progressive rock. Some of the bands changed. The Genesis, for example, pretty much stopped being a prog band, and they became a pop band and became hugely successful. But personally, my Genesis listening ends with their live album Seconds Out in 1977, and I probably wouldn't go much further than that. Yes also had a big hit in the early 80s with Owner of a Lonely Heart, which was a hugely successful single, and saw, yes, as well, perhaps scaling back on the sort of progressive rock elements and putting in more sort of rock and AOR and that sort of thing. Some bands did break up. Emerson, Lake and Palmer disappeared. Pink Floyd, well, they went on, as we know, up to about sort of early 80s there, and then Roger Waters left, and then Dave Gilmour sort of carried things along, and every now and then Pink Floyd pop out of retirement. They did so for a charity single not so long ago for Ukraine, which was fantastic to see. So nice that they are using their name and their commercial clout to do sort of good things like that. Jethro Tull actually are still performing. Now, I wouldn't say they're at their best, and I think probably Ian Anderson plays more flute than he sings these days. But yeah, they're still going on, and they're still releasing albums. And so, yeah, there's still an awful lot of progressive rock about. And that leads me on to saying it's both the best and worst of times. Because in one way, there's never been so much music around. It's so easy to make it now. You can sit in your living room with a Apple Mac and GarageBand, and you can produce music. And for an awful lot of artists now, it's almost like a little cottage industry. I mean, I've just bought the latest album by Steve Hackett. Genesis guitarist, left Genesis in about 1977, embarked on a solo career. Here he is with what must be, I don't know, 20th, 25th, something like that. I mean, he's done loads of solo albums. He records them himself in his own studio. He markets them himself. He gets somebody to design the covers. He organizes the manufacturing. No, I mean, these people can do everything and do it a lot cheaper than they used to, and are able then to pump out their own music, which makes it the best of times. The worst of times is the fact that there's so little money in it. Now, Hackett he'll go out and tour. He's touring non-stop. He must be in his 70s, early 70s, still touring non-stop, making a live album every time he tours, making studio albums every couple of years, and I think making a bit of money from doing that, and that's great. A lot of other bands finding it so difficult to make ends meet, and especially with Brexit, Eric, I don't know how much your listeners know about that, made it very, very expensive for British bands to tour in Europe because of all the paperwork and red tape that's now involved. So yeah, it's best of times in that there's loads out there and you can listen to it and you can get hold of it. Worst of times, there's no one's making money out of it, or very few are anyway. What's the future of it? Who knows?
1972, when progressive rock ruled the world. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing, and you can find it wherever books are sold, including burningshed.com. Always the best to get it there if you're in the UK. Amazon, you could get it in the US. Where can people find you online, Kevan?
I don't really have an online presence. Probably a little bit too old-fashioned for that. But if you go onto the Sonic Bond website there, you'll find a number of books on this theme of taking the year. There you will find not only the 72 book I've done, but also the one I did in 1967. And you'll find a couple of books I've done on a couple of bands. One is a folk rock band called Fairport Convention, which you may have heard of.
Led Zeppelin connection?
Led Zeppelin connection there. And then another band, sort of a space rock band who have been around for decades called Gong, who are probably a little bit niche. I accept that. Although I have to say it's actually on close to selling out, which is great to hear. So I'm going to be doing a reprint of that. But you'll find loads of other sort of great books about music on that. And if you love music as I do, these are just fantastic things to read, and to find all the stories behind the albums and all this. And so it is fascinating stuff. It's fascinating to research it. It's great to write it. It's even better when people read it like yourself and say, I really enjoyed that. Thanks. So, yeah, I've got a few more in the pipeline and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, really enjoyed this one on 1972, the year I was born. So I wasn't old enough to remember. Yeah, you were born.
Fantastic. There we are. Perfect, folks. Perfect birthday present for those who were born in 1972.
That's correct. Yes. Kevan, thank you. This was great. A fascinating conversation, and I look forward to having you back on. And congrats on a fantastic book.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Eric, for having me on the show. It's a great show. It's great to be on it.
That's it. It's in the books.